afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. Our membership is available at preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Joel Green. Joel grew up in Lincoln, attended Lakeview Park and Lincoln High Schools. Joel is a proud first-generation college graduate. Joel moved away to work in Philadelphia and Cleveland for two NBA basketball teams, and he returned to Lincoln in 2005. In addition to teaching for LPS the past 14 years, Joel and oftentimes his daughter Brooklyn continue to give public and private tours of Robbers Cave, sometimes 7 days a week. Joel is very involved in the Lincoln community as the vice president of the Lakeview Elementary School PTO and the worshipful master of East Lincoln 210 Freeman's Lodge. Joel's talk today is also the title of his book, Robbers Cave, Truth, Legends, and Recollections. And Joel will also be available to sign books afterwards, which are available in the bookstore. Please join me in welcoming Joel.
Hi everybody, thanks for braving the soggy day to come over. It's nice to be here. I've watched plenty of these on television over the years, so it's nice to be a part of the program. So yeah, like I said, I'm from Lincoln, went to Lakeview Park, Lincoln High. It's kind of an interesting story of how we ended up in Nebraska. My dad is actually from Sacramento, and the day that President Kennedy was shot, his dad took all the kids, drove them to Omaha, and they just never moved back to Omaha. Never moved back to Sacramento. So my dad was pretty sad. All of his baseball cards and everything were left there. And he lived in several different places in Omaha, and his mom wasn't really involved, and so there was a court case, and she decided that she didn't want to come out to Nebraska, and so they were actually driven from the court to Whitehall in the sheriff's car, and so he was kind of raised at Whitehall, and that's kind of how he ended up in Lincoln. So it's kind of another funny story. He met my mom 27th and her car broke down, and he's a longtime auto mechanic, so he helped her out, and I think one thing led to another, and they went to a double date at a Beach Boys concert, and I guess that's what I'm doing here. So that's kind of how we ended up in Nebraska. But anyhow, yeah, I've always been really interested in Robbers Cave. Like a lot of folks, when I was little, I had that book by Alan Boyd, Guide to the Ghosts of Lincoln. You're not going to want to read that as a historical text, obviously, but I was lucky enough to have a really cool aunt, Aunt Peggy. She would cruise us around in her old black car, take us to a lot of those spooky locations. So I was always really familiar with the place, and to the point where in 2003 I decided to start a book on it. And I would go to the Historical Society and sift through all the microfiche and things like that, but there was only about 6 or 7 photos of the cave, and so I got back into the project last year. Some folks were interested in it for the Lincoln Legacy Project, so I buckled down and finished it, and it came out in June, and it only took about 3 weeks to sell out, 3 weeks to sell out several Lincoln bookstores. So it's been a really fun summer for me. But in order to do that, I had to track down the old owner of the cave, 88-year-old Ed Scarborough Jr. He still lives over by the pen, where his dad was assistant warden many years. If any of you know him, Ed's quite the colorful individual. I believe he probably scares most people away, but he's very generous with his photos and his stories, and I feel like I ended up with a lot of information the Historical Society had no idea about. So definitely been a fun project and a busy summer, and so that's kind of how I got interested into in the book. A couple years ago, when the property was purchased and I heard that they were going to reopen for tours, it was kind of perfect timing for me. My younger sister was an employee at the restaurant there. She was doing their training for them and helping them with events and things like that, and she heard oh, you guys are going to give tours of the cave. I know somebody that knows all about the cave. So it kind of was just a perfect fit. And here we are 2.5 years later, and I asked a couple of the managers to do a little digging for me with their software programs, and they added up all the different avenues in which you can buy a cave tour. And it's surpassed 30,000 people in the past 2.5 years. So like I said, sometimes I'm there 7 days a week, and the most tours I've given in one evening is 8. So sometimes you lose your voice and your toes get a little cold, but I always enjoy seeing people's faces light up when they come back down for their nostalgia trips, and I enjoy hearing their stories, and it's just really, really fun to do. The third section of the book, the Recollections part, almost wrote itself, just from listening to everybody's stories over the years. I'm not going to lie, a lot of them, if the folks that went there for frat parties or whatnot, a lot of their stories are pretty much the same, what can you tell me about the cave or whatnot? And a lot of them kind of go like, I was here for a party, the stairs were really hard to get down, something was dropped or whatnot. We had a great time, and that's about it, so they don't really remember much about that. But I think the first reference to the cave as a social site goes all the way back to the 1880s. So there's a lot more to it than just the college parties and things like that. So I can start off by showing you guys the land grant. There's a historian from Emerald, or an Emerald historian, Dale Knobman. I believe he lives in Malcolm. He helped me track this down, and it's the old land grant for the cave. It's older than the city of Lincoln, 1864 on it. I think 3 geological digits, Yankee Hill at the top. When you get to the bottom, everyone at the restaurant's eyes got kind of nice and big, because you might be able to notice it says, I, Abraham Lincoln, deed this property to, or in testimony whereof, I, Abraham Lincoln. But after looking into it a little bit, I had to kind of be a killjoy that I believe Andrew Jackson was the last president to actually sign all of the his land grants, when the West was opening up and whatnot. So this was all the way back when the government was giving land to War of 1812 veterans. So a gentleman, Roswell Huntington's widow, Harriet Green, was the first one to own the place. And at this time, Abe Lincoln, I believe, had a secretary whose job it was to legally forge his signature for things like this. So still kind of neat to have, though. And then it was changed hands several times. And I was in the Scarborough family eventually 4 generations. I went JW to Fred, Fred to Ed Sr., Ed Sr. to Ed Jr. So Ed Jr. is the one that I tracked down last year. Luckily, he was still alive and warmed up to me a little bit and was willing to meet several times over the past couple of years. So on tours now, if anybody wanted to come see the cave, well, first of all, does everybody know where the cave is located? Sometimes I'm surprised, oftentimes people don't even know it's there. There's a lot of folks born and raised in Lincoln have no idea that it's even there. It's just south of downtown where 9th Street kind of turns into Highway 2, south of Van Dorn Park by the big white elevators. There's a Subway and Blue Blood Brewing Company. It's a few stories beneath the restaurant and the brew pub now. So just south of downtown. And big 5,600 square foot cave. About anywhere from 700 to 900 lineal feet, whether you count the cross tunnels or not. So if you wanted to come and take a tour, nowadays you sign up for them online. There's public tours, or you can call up their marketing gal, Ryan Murphy, and she schedules all the private tours. And you'd show up, and I'd take you down a few flights of stairs, and we would end up in what I know as the barrel room. But many, many years ago, we believe it was the ice house for the first brewery in Lincoln. Then it was a cellar, and then it was a storage shed, and then a garage. And so it's had several purposes, but that's where we begin the tours. And I kind of explained to everybody the safety things. It's a natural cave surface. It's very bumpy. It's very sandy. It's very uneven. You really got to watch your step. And the second thing is the walls. It's all Dakota sandstone, so we don't allow people to carve their names in the walls anymore. It falls off really easily. There's about 130 years worth of that already. So after we kind of go over the rules, I like to point out where the old staircase was. And the owner of the cave, Mr. Manzito, was kind enough to leave a few of the strings. I don't know if any of you guys were the ones that used to go and party at the cave after it had closed, but it was dark down there. There weren't any lights, and so after you would get in, you'd pick up a string, and you'd actually follow the string to whatever tunnel the party was in. That's how you knew where you were going. And Mr. Manzito left those strings dangling there, so that's always an interesting little thing to point out. And then we'll get started. We go right under this nice little arch into the first tunnel, and we get started on the tours. So this particular photo is looking from the west. It's dated anywhere from the very, very late 1890s to the early 1900s, but it's from the west edge of that sandstone bluff, and it shows the one natural tunnel, which is on the left side, and I'll explain the hole to the right later on, but you can see before anything was built there, it's a pretty bare sandstone bluff. And when you're standing in Tunnel 1, you'll see a photo of it here, and pretty soon, in 1896, all three tunnel ends were exposed at the west side. You can find references in newspapers to there being all three of them open before anything was built in front of it or on top of it. But if you, I like to ask folks if they're turned around yet, because the second we get down into that first tunnel, nobody really knows what direction they're facing. But you'd actually be facing west at the white elevators, and beyond that, Wilderness Park, Salt Creek. And I had Dr. Jokel, Nebraska State Geologist, come by on a few occasions, and the way that he explained it to me is that if you noticed in Tunnel 1, it makes a pear shape or a teardrop shape, and along with all the watermarks, it kind of showed him that the natural tunnel was formed by Salt Creek and Beale Slough flooding many times over the years. The water used to come all the way up to the bottom of that bluff and kind of lap away at the sandstone. The cave just started as a little pock in the bluff, and before it was eventually kind of repositioned to go through Epworth Park, which became Wilderness Park. And there's some rumors and legends that over in Indian Village, just east of the property, if you were standing at about 13th and Arapahoe, the High Street area, that's kind of the top of this sandstone bluff or hill. And the legends, of course, go, that's the promontories where Native Americans held their sacred rites, rituals, trials, things of that nature. And it is said those found guilty at the trials were to be buried at a low point in the bluff. And a lot of guests try to tell me it's right through that hole, but I have nothing to prove that. I don't want you thinking if you come to see the cave, you'll be walking around in an old graveyard or anything like that. But I can see why some people might think that the top of the hill is just to the east. You get to the bottom of the hill, and then you have a little tunnel that goes underneath it also. 1906, when the Scarborough family obtained it, they did sift through all the sand, did find some arrowheads and a tanning stone. They used to display everything in this neat shadow box up top, but vandals would break the glass, wipe them out often. So 1862 is first dated recorded use of the cave. It was either when a handful of settlers used it to survive a harsh winter, but it also was during a time of maybe some Indian attacks, so kind of used as a shelter over the years. But 50 to 55 year-round. Nice and cool in the summer, nice and warm in the winter. So it could be 100 degrees and steamy up top, or 30 below zero. It's always 50 to 55 degrees in the cave. There's kind of a better photo. You can kind of see where the original brewery's foundation sat. I'll explain a little later, but that hole right there is actually now Blue Blood's emergency exit. And when the first brewery sat there, you could get in and out of the brewery cellar. It would lead you right into the brewer's cellar. There's kind of an outline left from that. This particular photo was donated to me by Jim McKee. He said he'd gotten it from a scrapbook, and we know this family to be the Saulers, the S-A-U-L-E-R family. And when I gave a little presentation to the Genealogical Society, I was hoping they would be able to help me out who the Sauler family was, but no luck yet. And then that brewery that I was mentioning. Before we get into that, you have to, and walking from Tunnel 1 to Tunnel 2, you go through a little cross tunnel, and that particular tunnel is where the state geologist, Dr. Jokel, became pretty excited. You can really see the different sedimentary layers in the sandstone. The dark stuff is iron ore, the yellow stuff is limonite, and a lot of people ask, what's all this sand doing in eastern Nebraska, right? So, the western part of the state, beneath that little bit of soil, it looked like Egypt, right, the sand hills. But in the eastern part of the state, if you think of a big beach-like atmosphere, during the Cretaceous period, an advancing shoreline deposited right under eastern Nebraska. They're at the bottom of an inland sea at one time. So if you think about what kind of creatures we have in Morrill Hall, right? So standing in a pretty old beach, but you walk through that side tunnel, and then you're in the second tunnel. And I kind of walk up onto the stairs and point out that that's kind of that big hole that you saw is where the Lincoln's first brewery sat, right outside of that. Now, this is the only photo where we've found it to be called the Pioneer Brewing Company. Most of the time it's referred to as the Lincoln Brewery or the South Lincoln Brewery or the Lutz Brothers Brewery or even Pete's Brewery. So, but it started in 1869, and there was a couple of brewers. One was from Waukesha, Wisconsin, and the other guy was from the Red Wing, Minnesota area, Hastings, Minnesota. And they came and bought this bluff. They wanted to store their lager in the constant 55-degree tunnels like they did in the old world fashion. So they needed to extend it, and they did that by hiring a German immigrant by the name of Jacob Andra. And Andra was a horse collar maker from Lima, Ohio, and with a pickaxe, a shovel, and a wheelbarrow, he and a team of laborers worked on the cave for 4 years, and they are the ones that hacked out the 5,600 square feet of cave that we have today, all off that one natural tunnel. They even dug a well for the brewery. Some of you might remember Fat Man's Misery. It goes down 62 feet to the water source for the lagering process. Wish that part was still open to the public. There's some skinny spots you have to turn sideways, kind of scrape your way through. So fortunately, it filled up about 12 feet with mud, muck, sand, silt, water. So that's off limits to the public today. But initially, they dug so far down in the sandstone, they found petrified pecans and antlers embedded into the sandstone. So they were down there a ways. Also, when in tunnel number 2, if you look around, you can see a lot of nooks and crannies and holes and things like that. And I usually ask folks if they've seen any of the bats yet. Oftentimes, people will find bats hiding out. If you're there at the right time of year, the cave has brown bats, it has tricolored bats, but what they didn't know is they have northern long-eared bats, and those happen to be on the government's threatened species list. So the third tunnel, the southernmost tunnel, you go through a little hole, and in the 80s, that was a transient camp for one time. People would crawl in there to stay warm. But for 75 years before that, the third southernmost tunnel was known as the lunchroom. Big 30-foot picnic table back there, some of you might remember. A big fireplace chimney, things like that. Well, the picnic table is all rotted out. That's been removed. But the fireplace chimney, that's all still there. We leave that open so that the bats can come and go as they please. They fly in and out that way. And we had a mesh off the tunnel to protect the bats, but right through that hole is the little nocturnal bat habitat, blue blood, built to keep the feds happy, I guess you could say. Now the brewery was only open for from 1869 to 1873. It changed names. Several breweries used that spot, and eventually, when it closed, it became a sporting hall / dance hall. And I quickly learned. I gave Jim McKee my book to kind of read through and see if he could find any errors or anything like that to clean up. And he quickly explained to me that's code word for whorehouse. So apparently there was a cat house right outside of that hole. The old brewery became. And in 1885, the Anti-Horse Thief League, which was bigger in Kansas but had a little presence in Nebraska, set fire to the structure. And what was left of the lumber, the widow of Greenwood purchased and built a barn with it out by Greenwood, Nebraska. If anybody knows anything about that, please see me, because One photo I was not unable to find. I heard all that's left is the door. And so, but that's what happened with the old brewery structure. So with no structure there, you just have those abandoned tunnels, and it's the late 1800s. You can envision the cave was used for all sorts of seedy behavior, right? So that's when we walked to the end of Tunnel 2, and I kind of explained to everybody how we got the Robbers Cave nickname, okay? Before we go into that, I'd like to point out this photo here. This, I believe, is in a Journal Star book as well, and as predicted after the book came out, I was hoping a lot of folks would contact me with stories and photos and things like that. Well, Capitol Preservation Architect Matt Hansen let me know that this is a photo that's actually been erroneously used quite often, even though most people saw the photo and thought it was Robbers Cave in Lincoln. This photo actually is in Omaha, on the outskirts of Omaha. There's a 1954 article that describes the Omaha man named Frank Marsh, and he found the cave on his property, and of course he was claiming Jesse James legends and things like that. Then there's another man, Frank Wellna, who said that this home was built by Brigham Young in 1846, used by the James Gang and things like that, because Wellna knew this Hamilton family that operated boats from Omaha to St. Joe and things like that too. So this happens to be one of the photos, but when I was writing the book and putting the photos together, I can't tell you how many hours I've stared at it trying to figure out how that could have been Robbers Cave in Lincoln, and sure enough, it turns out it wasn't. So it's actually on the outskirts of Omaha. Okay, that's what what sits on top of the cave today. No more Scarborough family residence. Blue Blood Brewing Company opened in May 2016, so that's kind of where you have to go through to get the tours. So at the end of that second tunnel, I like to show everybody, when you're actually walking around through the cave, that first initial tunnel, it has the pear shape and it's really peaked and everything like that. But the rest of the cave has a perfect arch. The man-made part is a perfect arch. And when you get down to the end of that second tunnel, you look up, you can see the pickaxe marks. They're all over the place. So that's kind of when I explain how we get the Robbers Cave nickname. So, the radio programs and the TV shows, the magazines, obviously the first thing they all want to ask about is the Jesse James legends, right? So I decided to do a whole chapter in the book about that. And in order to get the info, I tracked down a Pulitzer Prize winning author from the Northfield, Minnesota area, who's kind of the authority on Jesse James. And right off the bat, he says you're not going to find any substantiative evidence of, Jesse James in the tunnels. The cave, obviously caves are a bad place to hide. And so, but I also found, or when you're on the run, but also found a second gentleman who owns a lot of the old property in the Missouri area. And I kind of listened to both of their arguments and put them both in the book. But the gentleman from Northfield said, like I said, bad place to hide when you're on the run, nowhere to put your horses, no second exit, there's no water source, there's no air shaft. He said, probably not, right? Besides, he said, James was the kind of guy that would shake the sheriff's hand and say, hope you catch him, and stay in nice hotels or something like that. So, but the second gentleman from Missouri said he understands that point of view, but his thoughts on it were that they were in a very abnormal situation, and it's a very abnormal cave, being that it's mostly man-made. There were horse stalls in the cave, there was a second exit, there was an air shaft, there was a water source, and it was right on the route down to Rouleau, where his mom Zerelda lived. He goes, makes perfect sense to me. But actually, if you match up the dates, oftentimes people think it's after the Northfield bank robbery that they would have come down through this area, and the dates just don't quite match up. So it's kind of something where it could be plausible but not probable, right? So, but there are a lot of his relatives that have come up from Missouri and taken tours of the cave. They're mostly the Mims and the Bacons from Missouri, or Missouri, as they say. And so yeah, always fun to talk to and things like that. When the Journal Star was really nice and did a front page article about the book and things like that, I really could have used a secretary for how many voicemails I was getting. I mean, apparently everybody in Nebraska's grandpa has a Jesse James tale, right? So, also when you're standing at the back of that second tunnel, you look up and you can see the pickaxe marks and everything. That's when I also kind of explained how another reason why it was called Robber's Cave is because when the Scarboroughs got it in 1906, their initial intent for it was to have it be a giant mushroom garden. You know, it's nice and cool and damp. But when they were cleaning it all out, not only did they find a few arrowheads in this tanning stone, they found a couple of rifles, counterfeit coin, gambling pocketbooks, copper tubing from old moonshine stills. And you know how rumors spread, right? Everybody's going to come see the place anyway. So they said, forget the mushroom idea, let's open it up. And that's how from 1906 all the way to 1973, and for a handful of years in the mid-'80s, just a couple years in the 80s, I mean, Robber's Cave was, open to the public for school field trips, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, picnics, birthdays, barbecues, frat parties. It's where you get the majority of those carvings from. They're just a lot of carvings on top of carvings on top of carvings. So anybody remember Grandmother's Restaurant? The Cornhusker band would play there the Friday before the home games. And when Grandmother's closed, Blue Blood took that over for them. They actually play in the cave now. They play on the brewery floor. When the crowd gets really large, they play south of the restaurant on a little concert venue. So pretty popular, really fun. I was talking to an old Lincoln High teacher of mine who played for the Huskers back in the 60s, and he was just describing how after the spring game annually, the Huskers would have a big party at Robber's Cave. The little cross tunnel was lined with kegs all the way up the stairs, and there's a little wooden stage at the back of Tunnel 2, and Bob Devaney would come by for a drink. I don't know about that, right? And you can still see the little hole where the extension cord used to drop down, goes all the way up and out the yard, and you didn't need speakers or amplifiers down there, obviously. It would have been for the lights for the stage. So, and also when you're standing back at the end of Tunnel 2, there's really big, deep carving of that I always like to ask people, anybody want to take a crack at what this is? And most people say an arrow or a mushroom or George Washington or Darth Vader or Yoda or something like that. But and it's actually a sphinx head, and I'd always heard that it was a part of some initiation rituals, but Mr. Hansen was found a reference to it in early 1900s. Apparently there was a secret society at the University of Nebraska made up of sophomore males, and they were trying to control the political climate at the time of the university, and that's where they would have their initiations. And they're kind of silly to read about. They include brutal beatings and a paddle, and they would let goats loose in the library with placards on them and things like that. So I remember looking at the list of initiates, and Ed Weir was on the list. So yeah, that's where the Sphinx head is. It's from the Iron Sphinx Secret Society of male sophomores at UNL, really early 1900s. So some of you might remember the Scarborough house. This is what it looked like to most, with a windmill cistern and everything on the right there. And when you're in the barrel room or at the restaurant, on the ledge are a lot of old rusty objects and things like that. There's lots of cans and bottles and tools that were found in the cave, and we had everything dated. Most of it's from the 50s and 60s, obviously, but some of the stuff goes all the way back to the late 1890s. The little apothecary bottles, cough syrup bottles, whiskey bottles, things like that. But there's also a lot of car parts and things, and everybody says, what's all these car parts? And Ed Jr. actually explained that to me. Where we enter the cave now, what I call the barrel room used to at one time be his grandpa Fred Scarborough, his exotic and tropical fish shop, right there halfway in the cave. And he had homemade aquariums and everything like that, imported tropical fish all the way up into the 1940s, and he couldn't get them anymore because of the war. And when it was no longer a fish shop, it kind of became a storage room for Ed Jr. And Ed Jr. owned Capital Shooting Supply, not far from the cave. And so that's where he would store his black powder kegs, his gunpowder down there and things like that. Well, some of you might remember there used to be coyotes on the property. The Scarboroughs had pet coyotes. You know, a lot of people said, no, they never had any coyotes, but ended up finding photos of them and learning their names, if anybody cares, Minnie and Seymour. But they were renting the property out to the Yaney family. Some of you might remember Yaney's Pet Shop. And they were burning weeds, and the coyote pin straw caught on fire, and boom, boom, these two, there goes Ed Jr.'s gunpowder kegs, right? He goes, you're bringing back some bad memories, boy, when he tells me that story. But anyhow, it ruined a lot of his dad's he and his dad's antique cars. And so they took all these car parts and just simply threw them into the foundation where the old brewery used to be. And so when Blue Blood is doing, prep work on the construction site, they're finding all of a Model A frame and a drive shaft and a steering wheel and things like that. That's actually where all of that came from, was this explosion in the 60s. Quite the family, I tell you. Some of you might remember the house looking like that. That's the 2-story Scarborough family residence. Ed Jr. had said that after they sold the property, they had wanted to move the house east of town on an acreage. But it was the second that it was sold, within a week, it was already vandalized beyond repair. They just decided to raise it, so that's what became of the house. Let's see. Some of you might remember old lady Scarborough, Esther Scarborough, known as the Canary Doctor, the Bird Lady. I had heard that she was also had a bird shop and helped fix up people's pet birds and things like that. And that was in the kind of the greenhouse off to the edge of the house. So found an old photo from that in the 70s. And while that's up there, curving around from Tunnel 2 to the cross tunnel, if you look down onto the right, the oldest carving we found in the cave is Sam Dalton, 1875. There's not really any way to substantiate the data on that or anything like that. A lot of folks ask, is that Sam Dalton from the Dalton gang? And I just kind of joke around with them that I think everybody's named Sam back in the day, right? So, but you actually walk over this little ridge to go into that cross tunnel. And I take people over to where this little side tunnel is. We know it as the question mark. I can tell you later on what the old owner of the cave refers to that is, but it's just a tiny little tunnel where you take one left turn and it stops. And not open to the public or anything like that, but you can only fit about 2 people at a time in there. And my little niece went in there one time and turned on her iPhone flashlight, and a little bat dropped down right on her chest. It was hilarious. But anyhow, that it used to be the bathroom. Okay, so, and it's not really part of the tour or anything like that. But the thing about that little tunnel is it kind of segues into, I have to tell everybody this is going to sound totally made up, but it's true. Back in the 60s, keep in mind how different the world was back then, but there used to be like a cave daycare system. People would drop their kids off with old lady Scarborough and a sack lunch, and she'd let them run around in there all day, unsupervised, right? I know what her logic was. All the tunnels connect, but you're not really going to lose anybody. There is a chapter in the book about lawsuits, by the way, if that tells anything. But a lot of folks that were a part of that have come back and taken tours, talked about how dark, how wet, how smelly the cave used to be. When it was time to leave, she'd flick the lights on and off. You're supposed to run up and out the door. Not all the kids knew that. Some were locked in there accidentally in the dark. So the older kids would hide in those little nooks and crannies, throw fireworks out at people in the dark. So kind of a crazy setup for a child care, right? So, but anyhow, I need to show you a picture of Esther Scarborough now, because I'm really glad I found a couple. There she is, Esther Scarborough, known as Old Lady Scarborough, or the Canary Lady, or the Bird Doctor. It's got one of the coyotes on her lap, and then over to the right is, I think that's her business where she would help fix up folks' birds and things like that. So, also in that second cross tunnel, you're kind of standing on a flat slab, And I always tell the story that a guest that was getting up there in age asked me where the dance floor was. And I had no idea that the cave had a dance floor. I had to ask Ed Jr. in one of our visits. And of course he told me it was right in front of the expletive hook, so I knew exactly where it was. But underneath all that sand in 1922, they installed a flat slab. I have the old ad for it. If you can envision flappers getting down to the Charleston or whatnot, you know, a band would have been playing right around the corner. So dance floor is right there. Some folks told me their grandparents would go and square dance at the cave all the way up into the early 70s. There's still some spots you can stomp around on it, and it boom booms underneath. But and then after that, we kind of head up through a tight little spot that connects Tunnel 2 to Tunnel 1. And I'll tell you guys about that in a little bit. There's Fred Scarborough. The photo on your left is of his exotic and tropical fish shop. There's a great interview that I tracked down. Library of Congress had it, and it's an interview with Fred, I believe, in the 30s. And that's where I got a lot of the Scarborough family history from, and all the different uses that they had for the cave and things like that. But he was a Spanish War veteran. Served with William Jennings Bryan, I believe. There's some of the coyotes. I know it sounds kind of brutal, but everybody's like, how did they end up with these coyotes? And Ed Jr. would just basically hunt the adults and take the cubs and raise them as dogs. He says that were very obedient and didn't smell like dogs do. So, and again, their names were Minnie and Seymour. And whatever happened to them, the Seymour was shot in Van Dorn Park. Ed said that when his grandma Esther got to be really old, they would get into a lot of fights, and she was pretty cranky a lot. And he did something to really make her mad, and she let Seymour go, and he was running around in Van Dorn Park and was shot by a policeman. And Minnie, the female, ran off, and the last time he had saw her was out by Union College. Before it was kind of developed, he had driven by and seen Minnie, and he hollered out, "Minnie!" And she turned and looked, but then just ran right back off again. So that's what happened with the coyotes. This is the entrance, what it appeared to be in 1973. Some of this might bring back memories, but you can see the white elevators in the back there. That equity grain, I think, was put in there in the early 50s. Ed Jr. had talked about how disappointed the family was. They had this beautiful view from the top of their ridge going down to the valley and a nice sunset and everything like that, and then up go those big steel white curtains, kind of blocking their sunset in the 50s. But that's what the entrance looked like, kind of an abandoned, scary, seedy property for many years. So. And then what's to the right of that door is what was the garage and the storage shed, and here's the back view of it. It's that same door, that same entrance that most people remember. Most people remember knocking on the sun porch, and Old Lady Scarborough would come out and undo the deadbolt for him and kind of crank on these dim lights that hung every 20, 30 feet or so, and then you'd go down a set of steps to a landing, you'd make a turn, you'd go down a second set of steps, and what's left of those stairs, you can kind of see the outline of it today. It's where those strings are hanging. So that's the back view of that. And this photo is Vi Scarborough on the left, and Ed is on the right. Vi is from Miami, Florida, and their son, Scott Mabin, is off in the distance to the right. He grew up on the property and gave tours at one time, and it was kind of fun to track him down and bring him back to the cave and walk around the tunnels with him and kind of see what's changed and what hasn't and things like that. And not a whole lot has changed. But he used to give tours of the cave, a little 15, 20-minute walkthroughs, and then he'd just let people kind of run around. And he remembers people having a hard time starting their car after coming up out of the cave because they used their key to carve into the sandstone, and it'd mess up the key. So it's funny to hear some of his stories too. that happened to any of you guys. This is kind of how I remember it. On the left, that's 1973, and to the right is kind of how I remember it, back behind Subway there. And they locked the door. That wasn't going to keep people out, so they boarded it up. Well, people would just pry off the plywood, and then eventually I think they put cinder blocks in front of it, and people would just smash those. And eventually they just bulldozed the whole entrance, and it looked like that, and capped it with concrete. But the saying, where there's a will, there's a way, that didn't keep people out either. If anybody's wondering how on earth you would get in the cave when the old entrance looked like that, if you came around to the west side at night and didn't get caught trespassing or whatever, you could get on your belly and shimmy all the way back into the bluff. There's a little 2x2 hole. And so some pretty hilarious YouTube videos out there, kids running around in there with sledgehammers, right, thinking they're going to find treasure and whatnot. So highly vandalized over the years. Explains a lot of the newer carvings. The cave was covered in spray paint and cans, bottles, tools, sacks, batteries. There's a mattress, there's a bathtub. I mean, everything was down there, pretty crazy. The videos are kind of funny to watch. I mean, whoever's down there is definitely intoxicated, right? They have no idea where they are. One of the kids thinks they're in somebody's old basement, and his friend says, "No, we're in an old mine shaft." And the guy goes, What do we mine in Nebraska?" And the kid looks at him and goes, "Corn." So they're definitely out of it. They're just kind of wandering around, not making any sense. Kind of funny to watch though. But this neat little story behind this wooden map. It hangs right by the cave's entrance now. It looks a lot older than it is. This is actually from the 80s. A gentleman that brought his daughters from Arizona up to Lincoln and was showing them where he used to run around as a youth. He took them over to Robbers Cave. Well, the cave was sealed up at that time, and so they were kind of walking around on the property, and he found this old map on a big trash heap, and he took it and kept it in his garage for many, many years. And after the restaurant/brewery reopened, he brought it back and said, "Did you guys really buy Robbers Cave?" And yeah, why? "Be right back." Well, he goes to his little Cadillac minivan, and he gets this old wooden sign, and he claims, "Stole this from you guys about 40 years ago. Time to bring it back." Well, he didn't really steal it. He just kind of rescued it from the trash heap. But the gentleman that did that was communicating with him back and forth via emails. I knew he was going to be a good friend of mine eventually. I could just get the sense of it. His name is Frosty Chapman. Some of you might know Frosty. He worked for the Alcohol, Liquor, Tobacco Commission for many years, good friend of Bob Carey's, and now he's my chess buddy. We play chess at the mill Saturday mornings and just talk. And apparently he worked at St. Elizabeth when I was born there, so we go out to dinner and things like that. He's a great guy, but we're really glad he brought this old sign back. It's a hand-painted layout of the tunnels done by Ed Scarborough, Jr., and it used to hang on the fence near the entrance to the cave. So it gives us all the little names of the nooks and crannies, Fat Man's Misery, Robber's Roost, the question mark, things like that. So really glad he brought it back after all of those years. This particular is kind of a then and now. On the left, a couple of gals came to Nebraska for a wedding from Michigan, and they came and checked out the cave, and that exact same stairwell, I put a photo up of what it looked like in 2015, so you can kind of see how nasty the cave was, I guess you could say. But that's the exact same stairwell there. And the remnants of that staircase is still visible today. You used to be able to take a left at the bottom of those stairs, and that would take you into kind of like a little birthday room with a picnic table and a little fireplace and things like that. But the wall isn't there anymore, and so all of that space right now is what I call the barrel room, and where we enter the cave on tours. Here's the arch that you walk beneath. The gentleman beneath the arch is Scott Mabin, the stepson that grew up on the property. And you can see the picnic table back in tunnel number 1, but this is where we enter the cave now on tours. really have to watch your step. Pretty sandy. And there's that first tunnel with the unique shape to it. That's Ed Jr. on the left and his son Scott Maben on the right. That's kind of where, in tunnel number 1, the tours begin. You can see the pear shape or the teardrop shape. And this next one, you can really see kind of the watermarks and things like that. What's behind him, there was some quarrying done in the late 1800s, so there's a lot of old stones back that enclosed off that natural entrance, and but it looks completely different in that particular spot than anywhere else in the cave. So you can kind of see the remnants of the old entryway. When you're standing back there, there's kind of a frame, but if you curve around to the right, when you're walking down that tunnel and you curve around to the right, this is what you would see right here. It would take you down to the well. When you're standing up there, you can look down into the well. The lowest point of the cave was 62 feet. Went down to the water source, but like I said, it filled up with about 12 feet with mud, muck, sand, silt, water, things like that. All that used to be there was that one horizontal bar, and so many people would crawl down there and pee and couldn't get back out, or they would fall. In the newspaper, you can read about broken elbows, broken back, broken neck, things like that. So those vertical bars actually came off the back of Ed Scarborough Jr.'s gun shop, Capital Shooting Supply. He took those off the back and just basically capped the well space. But if you look closely, you can kind of see the bottom of it, and that's the hole that you'd have to squeeze through to get into the bottom of Fat Man's Misery, and then it would lead all back up into Tunnel 2. So it all connects, but when you're at the bottom of the well looking up, that's what it would look like there. And I had no idea. There's apparently a group of folks in Minnesota and Wisconsin that all they do is go around to these old sandstone caves and they find places to recreate them. They have the old tools and everything like that, and so it was kind of a nice source of information. In Minnesota, they have encyclopedias of all the breweries and things like that. So, they could tell you what kind of drill was used to make this well shaft and everything like that. And that's how I found out where Michael Ulmer and Andrew Lindner had come from. The brewery in Minnesota had burned, and one of them jumped out and survived, and they teamed up and came to Lincoln and started Lincoln's first brewery. Here's another kind of then and now photo from the very first tunnel. This would be looking to the east. The one on the left's around 1908, and the one on the right was about 2015. So not a whole lot has changed, except for an addition, I believe, was built out of the cave. You can kind of see it's a little wider in the right picture there. So not a whole lot's changed. Just don't wear the boiler hats and carry the lanterns around anymore. This is another particular then and now. That's the first cross tunnel I was talking about, where Dr. Jokel got pretty excited because you can really see the different sedimentary layers in the sandstone. And if you look closely in the photo on the left, there's a little puppy up on the ledge there. The gentleman holding his lantern and his boiler hat. But it's pretty easy to stand in the exact same spots and see a lot of the old carvings. And so you walk through this cross tunnel, and it takes you into Tunnel 2, and this is looking toward the west. And this happens to be the 1912 UNL Union Literary Society. Before there were stairs and a railing, kind of just hanging out on the ramp there, and then that little hole to the left of them is the Fat Man's Misery that goes all the way down to the well and then pops back up into the first tunnel. So. A lot of the youngsters like this photo because the gal in the front appears to be floating 4 feet in the air, right? So, I think Willa Cather belonged to the Union Literary Society. That's the exact same location, but this was, I believe, this was a glass plate that the Historical Society had that had never been printed out before, so I went ahead and paid to have it printed off, but it is from May 21st, 1932. And with the help of Mr. McKee and Mr. Zimmer, I wasn't able to know just by looking at the hats, what organization this was. But Mr. Zimmer was able to zoom way in on the insignia or the symbol on the hats, and he was able to determine that this is an offshoot of the VFW. They are the fun club, kind of. They are the military order of the Cootie. So this is a group of cooties, Cooties. And they're in the exact same spot as that Union Literary Society, but what's unique about this photo, I thought that it's the only photo that I have seen where there's a wooden door behind them. I had always seen in the photos that had been stoned up and bouldered up, but that would have been what had taken you up and out to what was the brewer's cellar at one time. And then this exact same location in the 80s would have looked like this. There's Vi Scarborough and Fat Man's Misery, Scott Maben up on the top of the stairs, and then you can see where it had been stoned up or bricked up. So that's also looking to the west, exact same location. And when you go up those stairs and take a left, that's what would take you into the third southernmost tunnel that used to be the lunchroom, where the Bat Cave is now. So that's not open on public tours either because it's dark for one, and it's all meshed off to protect the bats. So. And that's kind of what it looks like today. Not a whole lot's changed. It's just that it was opened up to become Blue Blood's emergency exit for the restaurant and the cave tours. And Fat Man's Misery has some lights in it now. And if you were to stand in that exact spot and turn around, then you would see, you'd be looking to the east of Tunnel 2. So that's kind of how it has changed or hasn't changed over the years. And that exact spot right there, if you envision everybody crammed into that tunnel body to body like sardines holding candles, that is the around 1910s, the UNL Palladian Party, which was another literary society. I learned it was the rival to the Union. So if anybody remembers the Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams right there, they'd go down there and debate and recite poems and things like that. I like this one because you can zoom in on them and they're holding candles and things like that. So I got the original one of this right off the wall from Mr. Wendt at Blue Stem Books. So there's the third southernmost tunnel that became the Bat Cave. That's also the one that has the stove in it. Off to the right there is where they would have weenie roasts and cookouts and things like that. Notice how it says 3000 South 11th Street. Made the cave a little difficult to research because there's 6 or 7 different addresses for it. So. Changed over the years. This is at the end of Tunnel 2, kind of a popular photo that a lot of folks have seen. It's of a 1910 dice game, an often recreated scene, I guess, with holiday parties, company parties, class reunions, things like that. A lot of times taking big groups through the cave, they'll squat down and try to recreate that photo. But my daughter asked me, "What they doing, Daddy?" I go, "They're playing that board game, Trouble." I don't know how you explain craps to a 6-year-old, so kind of looked like they're popping that bubble, right? So you'll notice at the back of this photo, there's a little arch. This tells you it's the end of Tunnel 2, because here's what it looks like today. Exact same spot. A lot of the big chunk carvings are still there. That's also where the big, thank you. It's also where the big stage used to be. So, or not a big stage, a small stage, but for bands and things like that to play. They still have bands come and play every once in a while. They're called cave sessions. So you can kind of see the remnants of the stage back behind Vi Scarborough. But this particular photo, what it would look like today, is that. And I think I covered the Jesse James legends, right? That's a photo of him when he's 17 years old in his Quantrill's Raiders uniform. On his wedding photo, dated by the Library of Congress of 1882. So, like many places in the Midwest, anywhere there's a cave, there's probably going to be a Jesse James legend. So, and then from Tunnel 2, going back into the first tunnel, we get this cross tunnel. Off to the right is that little question mark tunnel where you can only fit 2 people. I like the one on the left. You can see a little African-American gentleman sitting back on that ledge with a lantern. Wish I could have blown that up a little bigger to see, but all the ribbon and coloring of the stone and the carvings are pretty easy to find when you compare them that way. This tunnel takes you back into the first tunnel. And when we crawl up this little space right here, another guest that was getting up there in age, she didn't ask, she told me. She goes, "I slid down a pole to get into Robber's Cave." Had no idea what she was talking about. So I asked Ed Jr. where this pole was, and he explained to me. So if you think at one time, if you didn't want to take the stairs, at one time you used to be able to, 30 feet right down into those tunnels via an old flagpole. And he, of course, explained, we cut that out a long time ago. Everybody landed on each other, right? And no duh. If you see it, you know what I'm talking about. But that's where the old pole was, and this takes us right back up. There's the air shaft. And then at the end of the tour, I always like to finish with a little story about, I had learned from a former student that you guys remember Emmy Award-winning late-night TV host Dick Cavett from Lincoln, Nebraska? Okay. He was really sad the cave was sealed up every time he'd come visit Lincoln from New York City. So I was like, well, shoot, it's not anymore. I'll make it happen. 2 Februaries ago when he was in town with Paula Poundstone at the Lead Center, I went and picked up Dick and Martha from their hotel and brought them to the cave, did a fun little private tour. And I would tell you some jokes that I tell on the tour, but this being televised and whatnot, I'll just tell you guys afterwards, okay? So if anybody knows Dick Cavett, talk about an interesting guy to give a cave tour to. He's going on and on about Laurence Olivier, Marlon Brando, Muhammad Ali, John Lennon, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, all of his guests, right? So yeah, we had a great time with his parents being teachers and me going to Lincoln High, him going to Lincoln High, things like that. So I followed him up to Wayne the next day, friends with a buddy of his. I'm sure all of you guys know him too, Ron Hull. So I went up to Wayne State and watched their show after that too. So even though he's in his 80s, he was running around down there, thought he was back at Sandy Dennis's 15th birthday party, which apparently she had there back in the day. And there's a picture of Ed Jr. I finally got him to come over and to the cave and look at photos and things like that. So, and there's his dad, Ed Sr. Flew in the Army Air Corps. Fred Scarborough teaching Ed Jr. how to drive on the cave property in the 30s. Probably 4 or 5 years old in that photo. And some of the glass bottles that Ed gave to me, the larger one I gave to his stepson because he didn't have anything to remember the cave by, but on one of his visits he just turned around and took it out of the cabinet and gave them to me. They used to sell these at the gift shop at on the cave, so they're all buried in Lincoln. So some photos of Fat Man's Misery. There's my little sidekick that I usually have with me on the tours. So if any of you guys want to come and check it out sometime, just let me know. I'd be glad to, set up some tours with you. And if you want to see the rest of the photos, you can always grab a book, robberscave.com, or there's about 14 places that sell them in Lincoln, Omaha, Kearney, Nebraska City, Seward, things like that. So that's about all I have for you for today. Thanks for your attention. Yeah.